Sarah Mitchell drove slowly through the tree-lined streets of Willowbrook Heights for the first time as a homeowner. The moving truck had already arrived at her new house on Maple Drive. She felt excited and nervous at the same time. After 15 years working for the FBI, she was ready for a quiet life with her family. The neighborhood looked perfect. Big houses sat on large lots with green lawns and neat flower gardens. Every mailbox matched. Every driveway was clean. The sidewalks had no cracks. It was the kind of place where people felt safe walking their dogs at night. Sarah parked in her new driveway and got out of her black SUV. The house was a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a red front door. She had saved for years to buy this house. Her daughter Emma would have her own room in a good school district. Her husband Marcus would have space for his home office. A woman walked over from the house next door. She had blonde hair and wore a pink jogging outfit. She smiled, but her eyes looked curious. "Hello there. I'm Linda Peterson. I live right next door." The woman pointed to a large brick house. "Are you the new owner?" "Yes, I'm Sarah Mitchell. Nice to meet you." Sarah shook Linda's hand. "Oh, how wonderful. We weren't sure who was moving in. The last owners were such a nice, quiet family. Are you renting or did you buy?" Sarah found the question strange. "We bought the house. My family and I are very excited to be here." Linda's smile got bigger, but something felt off. "That's great. I'm sure you'll love it here. We have such a wonderful community, very peaceful, very safe. We all work hard to keep it that way." 2 more neighbors came over. A man in his 60s wearing a golf shirt walked up with his wife. They introduced themselves as Bob and Susan Harper. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Bob said. "I hope you know about the HOA rules. We have pretty strict guidelines here to maintain property values." "HOA rules?" Sarah asked. "Oh yes," Susan jumped in. "The Homeowners Association. We have rules about lawn care, holiday decorations, mailboxes, fence colors, and lots of other things. You should have gotten a packet when you bought the house." Sarah remembered seeing some papers about an HOA, but she had been too busy with work to read them carefully. "I'll have to look at those papers again." "You really should," Bob said. His voice sounded serious. "The board takes violations pretty seriously. We've worked hard to make this one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. Property values here have gone up 20% in the last 5 years." Linda nodded. "The board meets once a month. Rick Brennan is our security coordinator. He helps keep an eye on things, make sure everyone follows the rules." "Security coordinator?" Sarah asked. "Oh yes. Rick used to work in security before he retired. Now he volunteers to patrol the neighborhood and watch for any problems. He's very dedicated. Some might say too dedicated." Linda laughed, but it didn't sound funny. The moving truck beeped as it backed into the driveway. 3 men got out and started unloading boxes. Sarah excused herself to help direct them. Over the next few hours, Sarah and Marcus worked with the movers to get their furniture and boxes into the house. Emma ran around exploring her new room in the backyard. Everything felt normal and exciting. As evening came, Sarah stood on her front porch looking at her new street. Streetlights came on automatically. She could see into the windows of other houses. Families were eating dinner and watching TV. Kids played in some of the yards. A white pickup truck drove slowly down the street. The driver seemed to be looking at each house carefully. When the truck reached Sarah's house, it slowed down even more. Sarah could see a man with gray hair and sunglasses looking directly at her. He wrote something on a notepad. The truck stopped at the end of the street and turned around. It drove back past Sarah's house again. This time the driver rolled down his window and stared at her for several seconds before driving away. Sarah felt uncomfortable, but tried to ignore it. Maybe the man was just curious about new neighbors. That weekend, Sarah and Marcus spent time unpacking and setting up their house. They put up curtains, arranged furniture, and started working in the garden. Emma rode her bike in the driveway and played with sidewalk chalk. On Sunday afternoon, Sarah was planting flowers in her front yard when a car pulled up. A man in his 50s got out. He had gray hair and wore a polo shirt with some kind of badge on it. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Rick Brennan, security coordinator for the Willowbrook Heights HOA. He walked over with a clipboard in his hand. Hello, I'm Sarah Mitchell. Right. You're the new owner of 1247 Maple Drive. I wanted to stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood. Also wanted to make sure you understand our community standards. Rick looked around Sarah's yard with sharp eyes. He wrote something on his clipboard. Is there a problem? Sarah asked. Well, I noticed your mailbox is black. According to Section 12 of the HOA guidelines, all mailboxes should be forest green or navy blue. Black isn't on the approved color list. Sarah looked at her mailbox. It was the same mailbox that came with the house. The previous owners had this mailbox. I assumed it was approved. Things change. The board updated the color standards last. Here, you'll need to repaint it or replace it within 30 days. Rick wrote more notes on his clipboard. Also, I see you've started some landscaping. All major changes to front yard landscaping need approval from the Architectural Review Committee before you start work. I'm just planting some flowers. Flowers are fine, but if you plan to add any bushes, trees, or decorative stones, you'll need to submit plans first. We want to make sure everything fits with the neighborhood aesthetic. Sarah felt frustrated, but stayed calm. Okay, where do I get the forms for that? I'll email them to you. What's your email address? Sarah gave him her email. Rick wrote it down and looked around the yard one more time. One more thing. I noticed you have visitors, pretty regularly. The delivery trucks, the cable guy, that sort of thing. Just so you know, we like to keep track of who's coming and going in the neighborhood, for security purposes. Keep track how? Oh, nothing too formal. I just drive around and make notes. If I see unfamiliar vehicles or people I don't recognize, I might ask them what they're doing here, just being careful. Sarah didn't like the sound of that, but she just nodded. Well, welcome to Willowbrook Heights. I'm sure you'll love it here once you get used to our way of doing things. Rick walked back to his car and drove away. Sarah stood in her yard holding a small shovel. Something about this neighborhood was starting to feel different than what she had expected. But she had just bought this house. Her family was happy here. She would learn the rules and everything would be fine. At least that's what she hoped. 2 weeks after moving in, Sarah found an orange notice stuck to her front door. The paper said HOA violation notice in big red letters. Sarah read it twice to make sure she understood. Violation. Mailbox color non-compliant with community standards. Section 12.3 requires forest green or navy blue. Current color, black. Correction required within 15 days or fines may apply. Sarah looked at her mailbox again. It was the same black mailbox that had been there when she bought the house. She walked to her neighbor Linda's house and knocked on the door. Hi, Linda. I got this notice about my mailbox. Can I ask what color your mailbox was when you moved here? Linda came outside and looked at the notice. Oh my, Rick is really cracking down lately. My mailbox was actually black too when we moved here 8 years ago, but that was before they updated the rules. Did everyone have to change their mailboxes? Linda looked uncomfortable. Well, not everyone. Some people got grandfather clauses since their mailboxes were already installed, but new residents usually have to follow the current rules. Sarah felt confused. So the same mailbox that was fine for the previous owners is not fine for me. I guess that's how they see it. I'm sorry, Sarah. Maybe you could talk to the board at the next meeting. That afternoon, Sarah drove to the hardware store and bought forest green paint. She spent her Saturday morning painting the mailbox. As she worked, Rick Brennan drove by 3 times. Each time he slowed down and watched her. The next week brought another orange notice. This time it was about her holiday decorations. Sarah had put up a small American flag and some red, white, and blue ribbons for the 4th of July. Violation. Unauthorized holiday display. Section 8.1 requires pre-approval for all seasonal decorations. Current display exceeds size limitations. Removal required within 7 days. Sarah walked around the neighborhood that evening. Many houses had 4th of July decorations. Some had large flags, banners, and multiple colored lights. Her decorations were smaller than most of them. She knocked on Bob Harper's door. Bob had been friendly when she moved in. Hi, Bob. I have a question about holiday decorations. I got a violation notice, but I see lots of other decorations that look bigger than mine. Bob stepped outside and looked at Sarah's house. Your decorations do look pretty small. Let me ask my wife, Susan. She knows the rules better than I do. Susan came to the door. She looked at the violation notice and frowned. This does seem a bit strict. Our decorations are definitely bigger than yours. Maybe there was a mistake. Should I call someone about it? You could try calling Rick Brennan. He's the one who usually writes these notices. But between you and me, he's been extra picky lately about new residents. That night, Sarah called Rick Brennan. His voicemail message said he was the security coordinator and compliance officer for Willowbrook Heights HOA. Mr. Brennan, this is Sarah Mitchell at 1247 Maple Drive. I got a notice about my holiday decorations and I'd like to discuss it. My decorations seem smaller than others in the neighborhood. Please call me back. Rick never called back. Sarah took down her decorations to avoid any fines. 3 days later, Sarah got her third violation notice. This one was about her landscaping. Violation: unauthorized front yard modifications. Section 15.2 requires approval for all plantings. Flowerbed installation proceeded without architectural review. Correction plan must be submitted within 10 days. Sarah had planted 6 small flowers along her front walkway. She had specifically asked Rick about landscaping when he first visited. He had said flowers were fine. This time Sarah decided to attend the monthly HOA board meeting. The meeting was held in the community center on Tuesday evening. Sarah arrived early and sat in the back row. 5 board members sat at a table in the front. Rick Brennan sat on the side with a stack of papers. About 20 residents filled the folding chairs. The board president was a woman named Margaret Wilson. She had silver hair and wore a business suit. She called the meeting to order and started with old business. Rick, can you give us your compliance report? Rick stood up with his papers. We had 14 violations this month, 3 for mailbox colors, 4 for landscaping issues, 2 for trash can placement, 3 for holiday decorations, and 2 for unauthorized parking. Any repeat offenders? Most residents corrected their violations within the required time. However, we do have some new residents who seem to need extra guidance about our community standards. Rick looked directly at Sarah when he said this. When they got to new business, Sarah raised her hand. Excuse me, I'm Sarah Mitchell. I'm new to the neighborhood, and I have some questions about the violation notices I've received. Margaret Wilson looked at her with cold eyes. Mrs. Mitchell, violation appeals need to be submitted in writing according to our procedures. Tonight is for board business only. I just want to understand the rules. I see other residents with similar decorations and landscaping who didn't get violation notices. Every situation is different, Margaret said. We evaluate each case individually based on current standards. Rick, do you want to address this? Rick stood up again. Mrs. Mitchell, I've sent you clear information about our community guidelines. The rules apply to everyone equally. New residents sometimes need time to adjust to our standards. But the mailbox was already black when I bought the house, and you told me flowers were okay to plant. Community standards evolve over time. What was acceptable in the past may not meet current requirements. As for landscaping, I believe I mentioned that major changes need approval. 6 small flowers is a major change? Margaret Wilson banged her gavel. Mrs. Mitchell, this is not the appropriate forum for individual complaints. If you have specific concerns, please submit them in writing according to our appeal process. Sarah felt all eyes in the room looking at her. Some neighbors seemed sympathetic. Others looked annoyed that she was taking up meeting time. Where do I find information about the appeal process? It's all in your homeowner packet. The same packet that contains the community guidelines you should have read before making any modifications to your property. The meeting moved on to other business. Sarah sat quietly and listened. The board discussed approving a new fence for the Johnsons, holiday lighting guidelines, and the annual neighborhood picnic. After the meeting, a few neighbors came up to Sarah. Don't take it personally, said an older man named Dave. The board can be pretty tough on new people. They usually lighten up after you've been here a while. Has this happened to other new residents? Dave and his wife looked at each other. Well, some more than others. I think it depends on how well you fit in with the neighborhood culture. Sarah wasn't sure what that meant, but she had a feeling she knew. Over the next few weeks, Sarah noticed Rick Brennan driving past her house more often. Sometimes he would park across the street and write notes on his clipboard. If she was outside, he would watch her but never wave or say hello. One morning, Sarah was getting her mail when Rick pulled up in his white pickup truck. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you about the landscaping violation. Have you submitted your correction plan yet?" "I'm working on it. Can you tell me exactly what needs to be corrected?" "The flowers look fine to me." "It's not about how they look. It's about following proper procedures. All front yard modifications require advance approval. No exceptions." "Even 6 small flowers?" "Even 6 small flowers. Rules are rules. If we make exceptions, pretty soon everyone thinks they can do whatever they want." Rick drove away without saying goodbye. Sarah stood by her mailbox feeling frustrated and confused. She had worked for the FBI for 15 years. She knew how to follow rules and procedures. But these HOA rules seemed to change depending on who was applying them. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with Marcus and Emma. She told them about the violation notices in the board meeting. "Maybe we should just follow all their rules exactly," Marcus said. "Even if they seem unfair, we don't want trouble with the neighbors." "But that's not fair, Daddy," Emma said. "Our flowers are pretty, and our decorations weren't hurting anyone." "I know, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have rules that don't make perfect sense." Sarah looked out her kitchen window at the neat houses and perfect lawns. Everything looked peaceful and beautiful. But something was wrong here. She could feel it. She had spent her career investigating problems and finding the truth. Her instincts told her this wasn't really about mailbox colors or flower gardens. This was about something else entirely. But Sarah was tired of conflict. She just wanted her family to be happy in their new home. Maybe if she followed every rule perfectly, the problems would stop. She would find out soon enough that following the rules wouldn't be enough. Sarah thought things would get better after she fixed all the violations. She painted her mailbox forest green. She filled out forms for her flower garden. She even bought a smaller American flag that met the size requirements. But the problems didn't stop. They got worse. On a Thursday morning, Sarah was leaving for work when she found Rick Brennan standing in her driveway. He was taking pictures of her house with his phone. "Mr. Brennan, what are you doing?" Rick looked up from his phone. "Just documenting some concerns that were reported to me." "What concerns?" "A neighbor called about suspicious activity at your house yesterday evening. I'm just checking things out." Sarah felt confused. "What suspicious activity? I was home with my family watching TV." "Someone reported seeing unfamiliar people going in and out of your house. Multiple visitors over several hours." Sarah thought about yesterday evening. "The cable guy came to fix our internet. And my sister stopped by with her kids." "Is that what you mean?" "How am I supposed to know who these people are? For all I know, they could be anyone. You could have knocked on my door and asked." Rick put his phone in his pocket. "Mrs. Mitchell, part of my job is keeping this neighborhood safe. That means paying attention when I see unusual activity." "What's unusual about having visitors?" "It's the frequency, and the timing, and the fact that some of these people don't look like they belong in this neighborhood." Sarah felt something cold in her stomach. "What do you mean, don't look like they belong?" "I mean they drive old cars. They dress differently. This is a professional neighborhood with certain standards. My sister drives an old car because she's a teacher and doesn't make much money. That doesn't make her suspicious." Rick shrugged. "I'm just doing my job. Maybe you could give me a heads up when you're expecting visitors. That way I won't have to investigate." "I don't need to report my visitors to you or anyone else." "Suit yourself. But don't be surprised if I have to keep checking things out." Rick walked back to his truck and drove away. Sarah sat in her car for a few minutes before leaving for work. Her hands were shaking. That weekend, Sarah's cousin Marcus came to visit with his family. Marcus was Sarah's age and worked as a mechanic. His wife Denise was a nurse. Their 2 boys were the same age as Emma. While the kids played in the backyard, the adults sat on the front porch talking. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Other families were outside working in their yards and walking their dogs. Sarah noticed Rick Brennan drive by 3 times in 30 minutes. Each time he slowed down and stared at her guests. "Who's that guy?" Marcus asked after the 3rd time. "That's Rick Brennan. He's the self-appointed neighborhood security guard." "Why does he keep driving by like that?" "I think he's trying to intimidate me. He doesn't like me having visitors." Denise frowned. "That's weird. What business is it of his who you have over? Apparently he thinks some people don't belong in this neighborhood." The 4th time Rick drove by, he parked across the street and got out of his truck. He walked over to Sarah's driveway where Marcus had parked his pickup truck. Rick pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of the license plate. Marcus stood up. "Hey, what are you doing?" "Just documenting vehicles in the neighborhood for security purposes." "Documenting my license plate? Why?" "This is a private neighborhood. We keep track of who comes and goes." Sarah walked over. "Mr. Brennan, this is my cousin Marcus. He's visiting for the day." "I don't care who he is. I need to document any unusual activity." "There's nothing unusual about family visiting on a Saturday." Rick looked at Marcus's truck. It was an older Ford with some dents and scratches. "This vehicle doesn't meet our neighborhood standards for visitor parking." "What standards?" Marcus asked. "Vehicles parked on the street need to be in good condition and appearance. No visible damage, no rust, no missing parts." Marcus looked at his truck. It was old, but it ran fine. The dents were small and the truck was clean. "My truck is perfectly legal. It's registered and insured. Legal and appropriate are 2 different things." Sarah felt her anger rising. "Mr. Brennan, my cousin can park anywhere that's legally allowed. You have no authority over public parking." "Actually, I do. The HOA has agreements with the city about parking enforcement in this area. I can have inappropriate vehicles towed." "On what grounds?" "Violation of community vehicle standards. The rules are very clear." Rick took more pictures of the truck from different angles. Then he walked around Sarah's property, taking pictures of her house, her yard, and her guests. Marcus watched him with growing anger. "Sarah, this guy has some serious problems." "I know. Just ignore him. He's trying to provoke us." But Rick wasn't done. He walked back over to the group on the porch. "I'm going to need to see some identification from your visitors, Mrs. Mitchell." "You're going to need to what?" "For security purposes, I need to verify the identity of people spending extended time in the neighborhood." Denise stood up. "Are you serious right now? You want to see our IDs?" "Ma'am, I don't know who you are or why you're here. This is a secure community. We're family visiting family. That's all you need to know. That's not for you to decide." Marcus stepped forward. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but you have no right to demand our identification. I have every right to protect this community." "From what? From family members visiting on a Saturday afternoon?" Rick's voice got louder. "From people who don't belong here. From people who might cause problems." "What kind of problems?" "Crime, disturbances, property damage. You never know what can happen when the wrong element gets into a nice neighborhood." Sarah had heard enough. "Mr. Brennan, you need to leave my property right now." "I'm not on your property, I'm on the public sidewalk." "Then stay there and leave my family alone. I'll go where I need to go to do my job." Rick walked around Sarah's yard one more time, taking pictures of everything. Then he got in his truck and drove to the end of the street. Instead of leaving, he parked and watched Sarah's house through his windshield. "This is insane," Denise said. "He's just sitting there watching us." "I'm going to call the police," Marcus said. "And tell them what? He's not breaking any laws, he's just being a creep." Sarah felt helpless and angry. She had dealt with dangerous criminals and terrorists in her FBI career. But dealing with Rick Brennan felt different. He wasn't breaking obvious laws. He was just making her life miserable within the rules. For the rest of Marcus's visit, Rick sat in his truck watching them. When the kids played in the front yard, Rick watched them. When the adults talked on the porch, Rick watched them. When Marcus loaded his family into the truck to leave, Rick took more pictures. After her cousin's family left, Sarah found a note taped to her front door. Mrs. Mitchell, please be advised that today's gathering exceeded the neighborhood limit for social events. Groups of more than 6 people require advance notification and approval from the HOA board. This is your first warning. Future violations may result in fines. Rick Brennan, Security Coordinator. Sarah counted in her head. There had been exactly 6 people at her house: herself, Marcus, Emma, Marcus's wife, and Marcus's 2 boys. How was 6 people exceeding a limit of 6 people? She called Rick's number. Mr. Brennan, I got your note about exceeding the visitor limit. There were exactly 6 people here today, including my own family. The limit is 6 people total, including residents. So I can only have 3 visitors at a time? That's correct. Where is this rule written down? It's in Section 23 of the Community Guidelines. Sarah had read those guidelines several times. She didn't remember any visitor limits. Can you send me a copy of Section 23? I want to make sure I understand it correctly. Mrs. Mitchell, it's your responsibility to know the rules. The guidelines were provided when you bought your house. I know, but I want to make sure I'm reading the right section. I don't have time to provide personal copies of rules to every resident. The information is available if you look for it. Rick hung up. Sarah spent that evening reading through all her HOA documents again. She found Section 23. It was about noise limits during evening hours. There was nothing about visitor limits anywhere in the guidelines. The next morning, Sarah called the HOA management company. Hi, this is Sarah Mitchell in Willowbrook Heights. I have a question about visitor limits in our community guidelines. One moment, let me pull up your file. Okay, what's your question? I was told there's a 6-person limit for gatherings, but I can't find that rule anywhere in my documents. Let me check our current rulebook. I'm looking through the visitor policies now. I don't see any specific number limits for family gatherings. There are rules about large parties and events, but not for normal visiting. So there's no rule that says I can only have 3 visitors at a time? Not that I can find. Who told you about this rule? Rick Brennan, our security coordinator. There was a pause on the phone. Mr. Brennan sometimes interprets our guidelines very strictly. If you received a violation notice that you believe is incorrect, you can appeal it through our formal process. How do I do that? You'll need to submit a written appeal within 14 days. Include copies of any notices you received and explain why you think the violation was issued in error. Sarah thanked the woman and hung up. She was starting to understand what was happening. 3 months after moving to Willowbrook Heights, Sarah had received 12 violation notices. She had appealed 4 of them and won 3 appeals. But the notices kept coming. Rick Brennan now drove past her house every day, sometimes multiple times. He had started taking pictures of her trash cans, her car, her garden, and anyone who visited her property. Sarah felt like she was living under constant surveillance. The final straw came on a Saturday morning in late July. Sarah was working in her front garden, pulling weeds and watering her flowers. It was already hot at 9 in the morning. She wore old jeans and a t-shirt. Her hands were dirty from working in the soil. She was focused on her work when Rick Brennan's white pickup truck pulled up to the curb. Sarah didn't look up. She had learned to ignore him when possible. But this time Rick got out of his truck and walked onto her property. Ma'am, you need to stop what you're doing. Sarah looked up from her weeding. Excuse me? You're working in the common area. This is HOA property, not your personal yard. Sarah looked around. She was clearly working in her own front garden about 10 feet from her front door. The property line was marked by a small decorative fence. Mr. Brennan, I'm working in my own yard. This is definitely my property. No, you're not. You're over the property line. That area belongs to the homeowners association. Sarah stood up and wiped her hands on her jeans. Show me where you think the property line is. Rick pointed to an imaginary line about 3 feet closer to her house. The HOA maintains everything from that point to the street. That's not correct. My property goes all the way to the sidewalk. I have a survey from when I bought the house. Surveys can be wrong. The HOA has its own measurements. Sarah felt her patience running out. Mr. Brennan, I've been nothing but polite to you for months, but you're wrong about this. I'm working on my own property. Ma'am, You need to gather your tools and move back to your actual property line. If you continue working in the common area, I'll have to issue you a citation. For what? Unauthorized use of common property, possible damage to HOA landscaping, trespassing. Sarah looked at the small area where she had been weeding. The HOA landscaping Rick was talking about was just grass and some volunteer weeds. She had been improving the area, not damaging it. Mr. Brennan, this is ridiculous. I'm not trespassing on my own property. It's not your property, and I need to see some identification to verify who you are. You know exactly who I am. You've been harassing me for 3 months. Ma'am, I don't know who you are. For all I know, you could be anyone. You could be a vagrant or a trespasser. I need to see ID. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. I'm working in the front yard of my own house. You've seen me here dozens of times. You've written me violation notices with my name on them. I need to see identification. Now. I'm not showing you my ID. You have no authority to demand that. I have full authority to verify the identity of anyone engaging in suspicious activity on HOA property. Suspicious activity? I'm pulling weeds. You're trespassing, and now you're refusing to identify yourself. That makes you a security threat. Sarah started walking toward her front door. She was done with this conversation. Ma'am, stop right there. Sarah kept walking. She had dealt with enough of Rick's power games. I said stop. Sarah reached her front door and put her hand on the doorknob. Don't you walk away from me. I'm not finished with you. Sarah turned around. Rick was standing in her driveway, blocking her path to the street. His face was red and he looked angry. Mr. Brennan, get off my property right now. I'll leave when I'm ready to leave. First, you're going to show me some identification and explain what you're doing here. I live here. This is my house. You know this. I don't know anything. You could be a squatter for all I know. You could be running some kind of illegal operation out of this house. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Rick's tone had changed. He sounded genuinely hostile now, not just annoying. What illegal operation? You have people coming and going at all hours, different cars, different faces. You could be dealing drugs. You could be running a brothel. You could be anything. I could be a homeowner who has friends and family. In this neighborhood, I don't think so. There it was. Sarah had been waiting for Rick to say something openly racist, and there it was. What do you mean in this neighborhood? I mean, this is a family neighborhood, a clean, safe, professional neighborhood. We don't have problems here until certain types of people move in. Certain types of people. You know what I mean. Sarah did know what he meant, but she wanted him to say it clearly. No, I don't know what you mean. Explain it to me. Rick's face got redder. People who don't fit in. People who bring their problems with them. People who don't respect community standards. What problems have I brought? The constant traffic, the loud visitors, the disrespect for rules, the attitude. Sarah had never had loud visitors. Her family and friends were quiet, respectful people, but she knew Rick didn't really care about noise or traffic. Mr. Brennan, I think you should leave now. I think you should show me some identification and prove you have a right to be here. I don't have to prove anything to you. Yes, you do. I'm the security coordinator for this community. I have a responsibility to investigate suspicious activity. There's nothing suspicious about me working in my own garden. There's plenty suspicious about you. Rick stepped closer to Sarah. She was still standing by her front door, but now she felt trapped. Rick was blocking her path to the street, and his body language was becoming more aggressive. Like what? Like the fact that you moved into a house you probably can't afford. Like the fact that you don't have a job that anyone can see. Like the fact that your visitors look like criminals. Sarah worked from home most days as an FBI tactical commander. Her visitors were family members, co-workers, and friends. Rick's accusations were completely false. My visitors are not criminals. How do I know that? Half of them look like they just got out of prison. Sarah's training kicked in. She could see that Rick was escalating toward some kind of confrontation. His face was red, his fists were clenched, and he was moving closer to her. Mr. Brennan, I'm going inside my house now. Please leave my property. You're not going anywhere until this gets resolved. What needs to be resolved? Your attitude, your disrespect, your complete disregard for the standards of this community. Sarah tried to open her front door, but Rick stepped forward and put his hand on the doorframe, blocking her. Move your hand. Not until you show me some identification. Move your hand or I'm calling the police. Go ahead and call them. I'll tell them about your suspicious behavior and your refusal to cooperate with community security. Sarah pulled out her phone. What are you doing? Calling 911. You don't need to call 911, just show me your ID and this whole thing can be over. Take your hand off my door. Rick didn't move his hand. Instead, he leaned closer to Sarah. You know what your problem is? You think you can come into our neighborhood and act like you own the place. You think you can ignore our rules and bring your ghetto friends around and nobody will say anything. Ghetto friends? You heard me. This isn't the inner city. This is a respectable neighborhood with respectable people. If you can't live up to our standards, maybe you should find somewhere else to live. Sarah had heard enough. She dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I need police assistance at 1247 Maple Drive in Willowbrook Heights. A man is on my property refusing to leave and blocking me from entering my house. Are you in immediate danger? Sarah looked at Rick. His face was angry and his body language was threatening, but he hadn't touched her or made specific threats. I'm not sure. He's being aggressive and won't leave when I ask him to. Officers are on the way. Stay on the line. Rick heard the 911 call and suddenly seemed to realize he might be in trouble. Ma'am, there's no need for police. This is just a neighborhood matter. You should have thought of that before you decided to block my door. I wasn't blocking anything. I was just trying to have a conversation. Rick moved his hand away from the door frame and stepped back. Too late for that now. Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm the security coordinator for this neighborhood. I was just doing my job. Your job doesn't include trapping me on my own porch. Rick walked back toward his truck, but he didn't leave. He sat in the driver's seat with the engine running, waiting to see what would happen when the police arrived. Sarah stayed on the phone with the 911 operator and waited on her porch. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. She was angry. Angrier than she had been in years. For 3 months she had tried to be patient. She had tried to follow the rules. She had tried to be a good neighbor despite Rick's harassment, but Rick had just crossed a line. He had physically blocked her from entering her own house. He had made openly racist comments, and he had escalated a simple gardening activity into a confrontation that required police intervention. Sarah was done being patient. It was time for Rick Brennan to learn that he had picked the wrong person to mess with. She just hoped the responding officers would be professional and fair, because depending on how this played out, Rick was about to discover that his suspicious neighbor had skills and resources he couldn't imagine. 2 police cars arrived at Sarah's house within 5 minutes. Officer Martinez, a young Hispanic woman, got out of the first car. Officer Johnson, an older white man, got out of the second car. Sarah was still standing on her porch. Rick was still sitting in his truck. Officer Martinez walked up to Sarah first. Ma'am, are you the one who called 911? Yes, I'm Sarah Mitchell. This is my house. Can you tell me what happened? Sarah explained the situation calmly. She told Officer Martinez about Rick's harassment over the past 3 months. She described how he had blocked her door and demanded identification. She mentioned his comments about her visitors in the neighborhood. Officer Martinez took notes while Sarah talked. Officer Johnson walked over to Rick's truck. Sir, can you step out of the vehicle, please? Rick got out of his truck and walked over to the group. He was carrying his clipboard and wearing a polo shirt with Willowbrook Heights Security printed on it. Officers, I'm Rick Brennan, security coordinator for this HOA. There's been a misunderstanding. What kind of misunderstanding? Officer Martinez asked. This woman was trespassing on common property and refused to identify herself when I asked. I was just doing my job. Officer Johnson looked around Sarah's front yard. Where exactly was she trespassing? Rick pointed to the area where Sarah had been gardening. That's HOA common area. She was working there without permission. Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Officer Martinez a photo of her property survey. This shows my property lines. I was working well within my own property. Officer Martinez studied the survey and looked at the area in question. Mr. Brennan, this clearly shows that Mrs. Mitchell was working on her own property. Surveys can be wrong. The HOA has different measurements. Do you have documentation of these HOA measurements? Rick shuffled through his clipboard. I don't have them with me right now, but they exist. Officer Johnson stepped closer to Rick. Sir, even if there was a property dispute, that would be a civil matter. You don't have authority to detain someone or demand identification. I'm the security coordinator. I have a responsibility to protect this community. What exactly does that title give you authority to do? Rick seemed to realize he might be in trouble. I patrol the neighborhood and report violations to the HOA board. That doesn't give you police powers. You can't stop people from moving freely or demand identification. Sarah had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. Officers, Mr. Brennan physically blocked me from entering my house. He put his hand on my doorframe and wouldn't let me pass. Is that true, Mr. Brennan? Officer Martinez asked. I was just trying to have a conversation. She was being uncooperative. Sir, you can't block someone from entering their own home. That's false imprisonment. Rick's face turned red again. False imprisonment? I'm trying to protect this neighborhood from people who don't belong here. Officer Johnson raised an eyebrow. What do you mean, people who don't belong here? I mean, people who don't respect our community standards, people who bring problems. What problems has Mrs. Mitchell brought? Rick looked at Sarah with obvious dislike. Constant violations, disrespect for rules, suspicious visitors. Suspicious how? They drive old cars. They dress differently. They don't look like they belong in a neighborhood like this. Officer Martinez and Officer Johnson exchanged glances. They were both experienced enough to recognize barely concealed racism when they heard it. Mr. Brennan, Officer Johnson said, Mrs. Mitchell has a right to have whatever visitors she wants in her own home. Not if they're criminals. Do you have evidence that any of her visitors are criminals? Look at them. You can tell just by looking. Sarah had heard enough. Officer Martinez, I need to tell you something important. What's that, ma'am? Sarah pulled out her wallet and showed her federal identification. I'm FBI. I'm a tactical operations commander with 15 years of service. Both officers looked surprised. Officer Martinez studied Sarah's credentials carefully. These look legitimate. Can I verify this? Of course. You can call the field office or check my badge number. Rick stared at Sarah's FBI identification with his mouth open. You're FBI? Yes. And for the past 3 months you've been harassing a federal law enforcement officer. Rick's face went from red to pale. I didn't know. You never said anything. I shouldn't have to. You had no right to harass me regardless of what job I have. Officer Johnson looked at Rick with new understanding. Mr. Brennan, did you just admit to harassing an FBI agent? I wasn't harassing anyone, I was doing my job. By taking pictures of her house, following her, making up violation notices? Those weren't made up. They were legitimate violations. Sarah spoke up again. Officers, I've appealed several of his violation notices and won. The HOA management company confirmed that some of his citations were based on rules that don't exist. Officer Martinez was still studying Sarah's credentials. Commander Mitchell, why didn't you identify yourself to Mr. Brennan before now? Because I hoped he would stop on his own. And because I shouldn't have to flash my badge to get basic respect from my neighbors. That's true, but it might have avoided this situation. Sarah shook her head. No, it wouldn't have. Mr. Brennan's problem with me isn't about HOA rules. It's about the color of my skin. Rick exploded. That's not true. This has nothing to do with race. Then explain why you've given me 12 violation notices in 3 months while my white neighbors get none. Explain why you demand ID from my visitors but not from anyone else. Explain why you called my family members criminals. Never said they were criminals. You said half my visitors look like they just got out of prison. Officer Johnson was taking notes. You said that, Mr. Brennan? Rick realized he was digging himself deeper. I may have said something like that, but I didn't mean it the way it sounds. How did you mean it? Rick couldn't answer. While the officers were questioning Rick, Sarah noticed that several neighbors had come outside to watch. Linda Peterson was standing in her driveway. Bob and Susan Harper were on their front porch. Other residents she didn't know were watching from their yards. "Officer." Martinez walked over to Sarah. "Commander Mitchell, do you want to press charges against Mr. Brennan?" Sarah thought about it. Rick had definitely committed false imprisonment when he blocked her door. He had probably committed harassment with his months of surveillance and fake violations. Depending on how you interpreted his actions, there might even be federal civil rights violations. But Sarah also knew that pressing charges would escalate this situation dramatically. The neighborhood would become a battleground. Her family would be in the middle of a legal fight that could last for months. "Can I have a few minutes to think about it?" "Of course." Sarah walked over to her neighbors who were watching. Linda Peterson looked embarrassed. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I had no idea Rick was doing all this. You knew he was giving me violation notices." "Yes, but I thought those were legitimate. I didn't know he was making things up." Bob Harper walked over from his porch. "Sarah, we owe you an apology. We should have stood up to Rick a long time ago." "Why didn't you?" Bob looked uncomfortable. "Honestly? Because his harassment wasn't directed at us. It was easier to just stay out of it. Even when you knew what he was doing was wrong, we weren't sure it was wrong. We thought maybe you really were violating rules." Sarah looked at her neighbors with disappointment. These were educated, professional people. They knew right from wrong. But they had chosen to look the other way when Rick targeted her because it was easier than getting involved. How many other new residents has Rick harassed like this? Linda and Bob looked at each other. "There was a Hispanic family 2 years ago," Linda said quietly. "They moved away after about 6 months. And an Asian couple last year," Bob added. "They didn't stay long either." Sarah felt sick. Rick had been driving minority families out of the neighborhood for years, and everyone had just let it happen. She walked back to where the officers were still questioning Rick. "Officers, I've decided what I want to do." "What's that, ma'am?" "I want to press charges for false imprisonment and harassment, and I want to file a federal civil rights complaint." Rick's face went white. "A federal complaint? For what?" "For violating my civil rights under color of law. You used your position as HOA security coordinator to target me because of my race." "I never said anything about race. You didn't have to. Your actions speak for themselves." Officer Johnson finished writing in his notebook. "Mr. Brennan, you're under arrest for false imprisonment and harassment." "Wait, this is crazy. I was just doing my job." "No, sir, you weren't. You were abusing your position to harass your neighbor." As Officer Johnson read Rick his rights, more neighbors came outside. Some looked shocked, others looked relieved. A few looked angry, but Sarah couldn't tell if they were angry at Rick or at her. Officer Martinez handed Sarah a card. "Commander Mitchell, you'll need to come to the station to file your report, and you'll want to contact the FBI Civil Rights Division about the federal complaint." "I will. Thank you for taking this seriously." "Thank you for your service, ma'am." As the police cars drove away with Rick in the back seat, Sarah stood in her front yard looking at her neighbors. Some of them approached her to apologize. Others went back inside their houses. Linda Peterson walked over. "Sarah, what happens now?" After Rick was arrested, Sarah sat in her kitchen and made the phone call she needed to make. First, she called her supervisor at the FBI field office. "Special Agent in Charge Williams, this is Commander Mitchell. I need to report an incident that happened at my residence today." "What kind of incident, Sarah?" Sarah explained the situation with Rick Brennan and the arrest. Her supervisor listened without interrupting. "Sarah, this sounds like a clear civil rights violation. Have you contacted the Civil Rights Division?" "That's my next call." "Good. I'm going to assign Agent Thompson to assist you with the federal case. This kind of harassment of federal agents can't be tolerated." "Thank you, sir. And Sarah, I'm proud of how you handled this. A lot of people would have escalated much sooner." Sarah's next call was to the FBI Civil Rights Division. She spoke with Attorney Patricia Hayes, who specialized in housing discrimination cases. "Commander Mitchell, based on what you've described, this appears to be a pattern of discriminatory harassment under color of law. Mr. Brennan used his position with the HOA to target you because of your race. What are the potential penalties? Federal civil rights violations can carry significant prison time and fines. If we can prove a pattern of discrimination against other minority residents, the penalties increase. I believe there have been other victims. My neighbors mentioned previous incidents. We'll need to investigate those claims. Can you compile a list of everything Mr. Brennan did to harass you? Dates, times, witnesses, documentation? I have everything documented. I kept copies of all violation notices and recorded dates of every interaction. Excellent. That's exactly what we need. Sarah spent the rest of Saturday writing a detailed report of Rick's harassment campaign. She had 15 pages of notes by the time she finished. On Sunday morning, Sarah's doorbell rang. She looked through the window and saw a man and woman in business suits standing on her porch. Sarah opened the door. "Can I help you?" The woman showed her FBI credentials. "Commander Mitchell, I'm Agent Thompson. This is Agent Rodriguez from the Civil Rights Division. We're here about the Rick Brennan case." Sarah invited them inside. They sat at her kitchen table and went through her documentation systematically. "This is very thorough," Agent Rodriguez said. "You documented everything, like a trained investigator." "I am a trained investigator." Agent Thompson smiled. "Right. Sometimes we forget that our tactical commanders are agents first." "What's the next step?" "We need to interview the other residents who witnessed Brennan's behavior. And we want to investigate the previous incidents with minority families. I can introduce you to my neighbors. Some of them seem genuinely sorry about what happened. We'll also need to examine the HOA's records. If Brennan was filing false violation reports, there should be documentation of that." Agent Rodriguez looked at Sarah's notes again. "Commander, I have to ask, why didn't you identify yourself to Brennan earlier? It might have prevented this escalation." Sarah had been thinking about this question all weekend. "Because I shouldn't have to. Every citizen has the right to live in their neighborhood without harassment. If I had to flash my badge to get basic respect, what does that say about how we treat people who don't carry badges?" "That's a fair point. Also, I don't think it would have stopped him. Brennan's problem wasn't that he didn't know who I was. His problem was that he didn't like what I looked like." Agent Thompson nodded. "We've seen cases like this before. Some people use any position of authority to target minorities. HOA positions are popular with these types because they have just enough power to make people's lives miserable." The agents spent 2 hours going through Sarah's documentation. They photographed every violation notice, every email, and every note she had made about Rick's behavior. "This is going to be a strong case," Agent Rodriguez said as they prepared to leave. Brennan made several critical mistakes, such as he documented his own harassment. Every violation notice he wrote creates evidence of discriminatory enforcement. He also made his racial motivations clear in front of witnesses. What about the HOA board? Are they liable? That depends on what we find in their records. If they knew about Brennan's behavior and allowed it to continue, they could face liability. After the agents left, Sarah decided to walk around the neighborhood. She wanted to see how her neighbors were reacting to yesterday's events. The first person she encountered was Linda Peterson, who was getting her mail. "Hi, Sarah. How are you doing after yesterday?" "I'm fine, Linda. How is everyone else doing?" Linda looked uncomfortable. "Well, people are talking. Some are shocked about Rick's arrest. Others are saying it was about time." "What are they saying about me?" "Most people are embarrassed that this happened. Bob Harper has been going door to door apologizing to people. He feels terrible that he didn't speak up sooner." Sarah appreciated that Bob was taking responsibility, but she wondered if it was too little too late. "Linda, can I ask you something honestly?" "Of course. Did you know that Rick was making up some of those violation notices?" Linda hesitated. "I suspected something wasn't right. Your violations seemed much more strict than what other people got, but I didn't know for sure." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't want to get involved in a conflict, and because I wasn't completely sure you weren't actually violating rules." Sarah understood Linda's position, but she was disappointed. "Linda, when you see someone being treated unfairly, Staying silent makes you part of the problem. I know that now. I'm sorry, Sarah. What can I do to make this right? Be a witness. Tell the FBI agents what you observed. Help them understand the pattern of Rick's behavior. I will. Absolutely. Sarah continued her walk and encountered several other neighbors. Most were apologetic and offered to help with the investigation. A few seemed uncomfortable, like they wished the whole situation would just go away. One neighbor, an older man named Gerald Foster, was openly hostile. "This is ridiculous," he said when Sarah walked past his house. "Rick Brennan was just doing his job. Now everyone's making this about race when it's really about property values." Sarah stopped walking. "Mr. Foster, what does race have to do with property values?" "Nothing. That's my point. This isn't about race." "Then why did Rick only target minority residents?" "He didn't. He targeted people who didn't follow the rules." Sarah felt her FBI training kick in. Gerald was using classic deflection techniques that she had seen in hundreds of interviews. "Mr. Foster, Rick cited me for having a black mailbox that came with the house. He cited me for planting 6 flowers. He demanded ID from my family members but not from anyone else's. How do you explain that?" "Maybe your family members looked suspicious." "In what way?" Gerald realized he was walking into dangerous territory. "I don't know. I wasn't there." "Mr. Foster, 3 other minority families have left this neighborhood in the past few years after being harassed by Rick. Do you think that's a coincidence?" "I think people leave for all kinds of reasons." Sarah could see that Gerald was not going to acknowledge the obvious pattern. She also realized that he probably supported Rick's actions, even if he wouldn't admit it publicly. "Mr. Foster, the FBI is going to be interviewing residents about Rick's behavior. I hope you'll be honest with them." "I'll tell them what I saw." Rick Brennan was a good man who cared about this community. Sarah walked away. She had learned something important from that conversation. Gerald Foster wasn't just a passive bystander like Linda Peterson. He was an active supporter of Rick's harassment campaign. That meant the problem in Willowbrook Heights was bigger than just one rogue security coordinator. There were residents who wanted to keep minorities out of the neighborhood, and they had been using Rick as their enforcer. Sarah's phone rang as she walked back toward her house. It was Agent Thompson. "Commander Mitchell, we've had an interesting development." "What's that?" "Rick Brennan hired a lawyer. The lawyer called and wants to discuss a plea deal." "Already?" "It's only been 1 day. His lawyer knows this is a losing case. Brennan is facing serious federal charges and the evidence against him is overwhelming." "What kind of plea deal?" "Full cooperation with our investigation into the HOA's discriminatory practices, information about other incidents, and a guilty plea to civil rights violations." Sarah thought about this. What would he get in return? Reduced prison time. Probably 2 years instead of 5 or more. Is that acceptable? "That's up to you and the other victims. We can't make a deal without your input." Sarah considered the options. A plea deal would mean Rick admitted guilt and provided information about other incidents. It would also mean a faster resolution and less trauma for her family. But it would also mean Rick got a lighter sentence than he deserved. "Agent Thompson, I want to think about this. Can I call you back tomorrow?" "Of course. Take all the time you need." That evening, Sarah sat down with Marcus and Emma to discuss the situation. "Daddy, why was that man so mean to us?" Emma asked. "Because some people have hate in their hearts, sweetheart. They don't like people who look different from them." "But that's stupid. People are people." "You're absolutely right. But not everyone understands that." Marcus looked at Sarah. "What do you think about the plea deal?" "I'm torn. Part of me wants Rick to face the maximum penalty." 3 weeks after Rick's arrest, Sarah met with Agent Thompson and Agent Rodriguez at the FBI field office. Rick's lawyer had arranged for him to provide information in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rick sat at a conference table with his lawyer, looking much smaller than he had when he was harassing Sarah. His confident attitude was gone. He looked scared and defeated. "Mr. Brennan," Agent Rodriguez began, "you've agreed to provide complete and truthful information about discriminatory practices in Willowbrook Heights. Is that correct?" "Yes," Rick said quietly. "Let's start with your role as HOA security coordinator. Who gave you that position? The board appointed me 3 years ago. Margaret Wilson, the president, said they needed someone to enforce community standards more strictly. What did she mean by community standards? Rick's lawyer whispered something in his ear. Rick nodded. She knows the evidence against her is strong. Her lawyer says she's willing to resign from the board and pay damages to the victims. What about prison time? She's hoping to avoid that with cooperation and restitution. But that's up to the prosecutor and the judge. Sarah considered this. Margaret Wilson was the architect of the harassment campaign, but she was also an older woman with no prior criminal record. What kind of cooperation? Full disclosure of how the harassment scheme worked. Names of everyone involved. Documentation of all discriminatory enforcement decisions. And restitution. Payment for moving expenses and damages to the families who were driven out. Plus funding for fair housing training for the entire HOA. Sarah liked the idea of mandatory training. What do you think I should do? That's your decision, Commander. But remember, this isn't just about punishment. It's about making sure this never happens again. Sarah thought about Emma and the other children in the neighborhood. They deserve to grow up in a community where everyone was welcome. I'll consider the plea deal if Margaret Wilson agrees to public acknowledgement of what she did and a commitment to supporting fair housing practices. I'll pass that along to her lawyer. After hanging up, Sarah sat on her front porch and looked at her neighborhood. Kids were playing in the street. Families were having barbecues in their backyards. It looked peaceful and normal. But Sarah now knew the ugly truth beneath the surface. Willowbrook Heights had been a place where certain people were welcome and others were not, where rules were enforced selectively based on the color of people's skin. That was going to change. Sarah would make sure of it. Her neighbor, Bob Harper, walked over from his house. Sarah, I heard about Margaret Wilson. Is it true she's being arrested? I can't comment on an ongoing investigation, Bob. I understand. I just want you to know that some of us are ashamed of what happened. We should have spoken up. You can speak up now. When this is over, the neighborhood will need new leadership. Are you thinking of running for the board? I'm thinking about it. Bob smiled. You'd have my vote, and my wife's. We need someone who will treat everyone fairly. As Bob walked back to his house, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in months. The harassment campaign against her had revealed something important about her community. But it had also created an opportunity to build something better. Margaret Wilson and Gerald Foster had used fear and prejudice to control their neighborhood. Sarah would use fairness and justice to heal it. The fight for Willowbrook Heights was almost over, but the work of building a truly welcoming community was just beginning. Said the neighborhood was changing in ways that might hurt property values. She wanted someone to make sure new residents understood expectations. Agent Thompson leaned forward. What kind of expectations? Keeping properties neat. Following all the rules exactly, not causing any problems. Were you given specific instructions about how to treat different types of residents? Rick hesitated. Not specific instructions, but Margaret made it clear that some residents needed more oversight than others. Which residents? New residents, especially ones who might not fit in with the neighborhood culture. Sarah spoke up. Mr. Brennan, what did Margaret Wilson mean by neighborhood culture? Rick looked at Sarah, then back at his lawyer. She said Willowbrook Heights had a certain character, professional families, clean, quiet, traditional values. She didn't want that to change. Agent Rodriguez took notes. Did she ever mention race specifically? Not directly, but she talked about maintaining the neighborhood demographic. She said some changes in demographics could hurt everyone's property values. Did other board members share these views? Margaret was the leader, but yes. Gerald Foster was very vocal about it. He said we needed to be careful about who we allowed to get comfortable in the neighborhood. Sarah's suspicions about Gerald Foster were confirmed. How many board members supported this approach? All 5 of them, to some degree. Some were more active than others. Agent Thompson showed Rick a list of names. These are the minority, families who lived in Willowbrook Heights over the past 3 years. Tell us about your interactions with each family. Rick went through the list slowly. The pattern was clear and disturbing. The Rodriguez family had lived on Oak Street for 8 months before moving away. Rick had cited them for parking violations, noise complaints, and unauthorized modifications to their yard. Most of the citations were for things that other residents did without consequence. The Rodriguez family had 3 teenagers, Rick explained. Gerald Foster complained that they were too loud when they played basketball in their driveway. He said it was bringing down the neighborhood tone. Did you investigate these noise complaints? I drove by a few times when the kids were playing. They weren't any louder than kids in other driveways, but Gerald kept calling and demanding action. So you cited them anyway? I told them they needed to limit their outdoor activities to certain hours. When they didn't comply exactly, I wrote them up. The Chen family had lasted only 6 months. Rick had targeted them for holiday decorations that were allegedly too bright and for having too many cars in their driveway during family gatherings. Mrs. Chen's parents came to visit every Sunday after church, Rick said. Sometimes her brothers and sisters came too. Gerald said it looked like a commercial business with all the cars. How many cars? Usually 4 or 5. But other families had big gatherings too without any complaints. Agent Rodriguez looked at Sarah. Commander Mitchell, how many cars were at your house when you had your cousin's family visit? 3. My car, my husband's car, and my cousin's truck. And you received a violation notice for that gathering? Yes. Rick said I exceeded the limit for social events. Rick looked ashamed. Margaret Wilson told me to watch Commander Mitchell's house closely. She said new residents sometimes tested the rules to see what they could get away with. Did she tell you to target Commander Mitchell specifically? Rick's lawyer whispered to him again. Rick nodded. Margaret said Commander Mitchell seemed like someone who might challenge authority. She told me to document everything and not let anything slide. Sarah felt angry but not surprised. Margaret Wilson had targeted her from the beginning and Rick had been her weapon. Mr. Brennan, let's talk about the fake violation notices, Agent Thompson said. They weren't fake. They were based on legitimate interpretations of the rules. The visitor limit that you cited Commander Mitchell for doesn't exist in the HOA guidelines. Rick shifted uncomfortably. Margaret said the noise ordinance could be interpreted to include limits on gathering sizes. Did you cite anyone else for having 6 people at their house? No. Why not? Because no one else seemed to be testing the boundaries like Commander Mitchell was. Agent Rodriguez showed Rick copies of several violation notices. Mr. Brennan, you cited Commander Mitchell for having a black mailbox, but at least 8 other houses in the neighborhood have black mailboxes. Why weren't they cited? Those mailboxes were grandfathered in. According to whom? Margaret said existing mailboxes could stay until they needed to be replaced. But Commander Mitchell's mailbox was also existing. She didn't install it. Margaret said new owners had to bring everything up to current standards immediately. Even though the HOA guidelines don't say that? Rick was quiet for a moment. Margaret said we had flexibility in how we interpreted the rules. The interrogation continued for 3 hours. By the end, a clear picture had emerged. Margaret Wilson and Gerald Foster had been the driving forces behind the harassment campaign. They had used Rick as their enforcement tool to make life miserable for minority residents until they moved away. The strategy had worked. 3 families had left the neighborhood after being subjected to constant harassment and frivolous citations. Rick had documented everything, believing he was protecting himself legally, but his documentation had actually created a perfect evidence trail of the conspiracy. Mr. Brennan, Agent Rodriguez said, are you willing to testify against the board members who directed your actions? Rick looked at his lawyer, who nodded. Yes, I'll testify. I was following their instructions. I thought I was doing my job. Agent Thompson gathered the documents. Mr. Brennan, you'll be sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. The other defendants will face their own charges. After Rick and his lawyer left, Sarah met privately with the FBI agents. What happens now? She asked. Now we arrest Margaret Wilson and Gerald Foster, the other board. 6 months after Rick Brennan's arrest, Sarah stood in the Willowbrook Heights Community Center addressing a packed room. She was wearing a simple blue dress and speaking into a microphone that barely worked. Thank you all for coming to tonight's HOA board meeting. As your newly elected president, I want to start by acknowledging the harm that was done to families in our neighborhood. The room was quiet. About 60 residents had come to the meeting, more than had ever attended before. Some faces were familiar. Others belonged to people Sarah had never met. We're here tonight to make sure that what happened to me, and to the Rodriguez family and to the Chen family never happens again. Sarah had won the HOA board election by a landslide 2 months earlier. After Margaret Wilson and Gerald Foster were arrested, the remaining board members had resigned. New elections were held and Sarah ran unopposed for president. Her first act was to invite the Rodriguez and Chen families back to the neighborhood. The HOA would pay their moving expenses and help them find new homes if they wanted to return. The Rodriguez family had decided to stay in their new neighborhood, but they appreciated the gesture. The Chen family was considering moving back to Willowbrook Heights. Tonight we're voting on new community guidelines, Sarah continued. These guidelines will ensure that HOA rules are enforced fairly and equally for all residents. The new guidelines were simple but powerful. All violation notices had to be approved by the full board, not just one person. Residents who received citations had the right to appeal immediately. And most importantly, the HOA would track enforcement statistics to identify any patterns of discriminatory treatment. We're also establishing a community relations committee, Sarah announced. This committee will organize events to bring neighbors together and address any conflicts before they escalate. Linda Peterson had volunteered to chair the new committee. She had worked hard over the past 6 months to make amends for her silence during Sarah's harassment. Bob Harper raised his hand. Sarah, what's the latest on the legal cases? Sarah had been waiting for this question. Rick Brennan was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison last week. He's also required to perform 500 hours of community service with fair housing organizations when he's released. The room murmured with satisfaction. Rick's sentence was fair, but firm. Margaret Wilson and Gerald Foster both pled guilty to civil rights violations. Margaret got 6 months in prison and 3 years of probation. Gerald got 1 year in prison. They also have to pay $50,000 each in damages to the families they targeted. What about the other board members? Someone asked. Thomas Wright and Patricia Mills were not charged criminally, but they've agreed to pay smaller amounts in civil settlements. Michael Roberts was found to have no knowledge of the harassment scheme. Sarah was satisfied with these outcomes. The main conspirators faced real consequences while people who were simply passive got smaller penalties. There's one more piece of legal news, Sarah said. The Department of Justice has announced that they're using our case as a model for investigating HOA discrimination nationwide. They're setting up a task force to look into similar problems in other communities. This was the news Sarah was most proud of. Her case would help protect other families facing harassment in their own neighborhoods. Agent Rodriguez had told her that complaints against HOAs had increased dramatically since news of the Willowbrook Heights case spread. People who had been suffering in silence were finally speaking up. After the official meeting ended, many residents stayed to talk with Sarah privately. Some apologized for not helping during her harassment. Others asked how they could volunteer with the new community programs. Gerald Foster's wife, Marilyn, approached Sarah near the end of the evening. Sarah, I wanted to apologize personally for what my husband did. I had no idea he was involved in targeting you and the other families. Sarah studied Marilyn's face. She seemed genuinely ashamed and remorseful. I appreciate your apology, Marilyn. How is Gerald handling his prison sentence? It's been hard, but he's finally starting to understand how wrong he was. He's been reading books about civil rights and taking classes. I think he's genuinely changing. Sarah hoped that was true. Gerald had been one of the most vocal supporters of the harassment campaign, but people could change if they really wanted to. Will you stay in the neighborhood? I don't know yet. Some people here will never forgive Gerald for what he did, but others have been very supportive. Linda Peterson has been especially kind. Sarah was glad to hear that. Healing would require forgiveness as well as justice. The last person to approach Sarah was a young black woman she didn't recognize. Ms. Mitchell, I'm Jasmine Williams. My family is thinking about buying a house on Pine Street. I wanted to meet you and ask about the neighborhood. Sarah smiled. This was exactly what she had hoped for. It's a wonderful neighborhood, Jasmine. What questions do you have? Is it really safe for Black families now? I've heard about what happened to you, but I want to make sure the problems are really solved. The legal problems are solved. The cultural problems are still being worked on. But I can promise you that any harassment or discrimination will be taken seriously by the board and the police. Jasmine looked relieved. My husband and I both work from home, so we'll be around during the day. We have 2 young kids who need a safe place to play. Your kids will love it here, and they'll have plenty of friends. Emma would be excited to meet them. After everyone left, Sarah walked around the empty community center. 6 months ago, she had sat in this same room feeling isolated and unwelcome. Tonight, she had presided over it as the elected leader of her community. The transformation had been remarkable, but Sarah knew the work wasn't finished. Changing laws and procedures was easier than changing hearts and minds. Some residents had embraced the new direction enthusiastically. They organized block parties, started neighborhood watch programs focused on helping rather than harassing, and created welcome committees for new residents. Other residents remained quietly resentful. They had supported the old system and didn't like the changes. Sarah watched these residents carefully, but she couldn't punish people for their thoughts, only their actions. A few residents had moved away rather than live in a more diverse neighborhood. Sarah was sorry to see anyone leave, but she wasn't sorry to see intolerance leave. As Sarah locked up the community center, her phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Rodriguez. Sarah, wanted you to know that the DOJ task force has opened. Investigations in 12 cities based on complaints inspired by your case. You've started something important. Sarah smiled as she walked to her car. She had never intended to become a civil rights advocate. She had just wanted to live peacefully, with her family. But sometimes people are called to do more than they planned. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who faces the same challenges. When Sarah got home, Marcus and Emma were waiting up for her. How did the meeting go, Mommy? Emma asked. Very well, sweetheart. We're making the neighborhood better for everyone. Are the mean people gone now? The meanest ones are gone. But our job is to help the other people learn to be kinder. Emma nodded seriously. At 8 years old, she understood fairness better than many adults. Marcus hugged Sarah. I'm proud of you. This whole experience could have made you bitter, but instead you've made it into something positive. I had help. The FBI agents, the neighbors who finally spoke up, the lawyers who took the case seriously. It takes a community to fight injustice. What's next? Sarah looked out her window at the quiet streets of Willowbrook Heights. Porch lights were on. Children's bikes were scattered on lawns. It looked like any peaceful suburban neighborhood, but Sarah knew it was more than that now. It was a place where justice had been served and healing had begun. It was a community that had confronted its worst impulses and chosen to be better. Next, we keep building. We keep welcoming new families. We keep making sure everyone feels safe and valued. Think it will work? Sarah thought about Jasmine Williams and her family considering a move to Pine Street. She thought about the Chen family possibly returning. She thought about the kids who would grow up in a Willowbrook Heights where discrimination was not tolerated. Yes, she said. It will work. Not perfectly, and not without ongoing effort. But it will work. That night, Sarah sat on her front porch and looked at her neighborhood one more time. The same houses, the same streets, the same trees. But everything was different now. Rick Brennan's campaign of harassment had been intended to drive her away. Instead, it had given her a deeper appreciation for home and community. It had taught her that sometimes fighting for justice means fighting for the right to belong. Sarah Mitchell had come to Willowbrook Heights looking for a quiet place to raise her family. She had found that, but she had also found something more. She had found her calling as a leader, an advocate, and a neighbor who would never again stay silent when others faced injustice. The harassment was over. The healing would continue. And Willowbrook Heights would be stronger because one woman had refused to be driven away from the place she chose to call home.